out from the marsh, from the foot of misty hills and bogs bearing God's hatred, Grendel came, hoping to kill anyone he could trap on this trip to High Herat. He moved quickly through the cloudy night, up from his swampland, sliding silently toward that gold-shining hall. He had visited Hrothgar's home before, knew the way. But never before nor after that night found Herat defended so firmly, his reception so harsh. He journeyed forever joyless, straight to that door. Then he snapped it open, tore its iron fasteners with a touch, and rushed angrily over the threshold. He strode quickly across the inlaid floor, snarling and fierce. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, burned with gruesome light. Then he stopped, seeing the hall, crowded with sleeping soldiers, stuffed with rows of young soldiers resting together. And his heart laughed. He relished the sight, intended to tear life from those bodies. By morning, the monster's mind was hot with the thought of food and feasting his belly would soon know. But fate that night intended Grendel to gnaw the broken bones of his last human summer. Human eyes were watching his evil steps, waiting to see his swift hard claws. Grendel snatched at the first skeet he came to, ripped him apart, cut his body to bits with powerful jaws, drank the blood from his veins and bolted him down. Hands and feet, death and Grendel's great teeth came together, snapping life shut. Then he stepped to another still body, clutched at Beowulf's with his claws, grasped at his strong-hearted wakeful sleeper, and was instantly seized himself, claws bent back as Beowulf leaned up on one arm. That shepherd of evil, guardian of crime, knew at once that nowhere on earth had he met a man whose hands were harder. His mind was flooded with fear, but nothing could take his talons and himself from tight hard grip. Grendel's one thought was to run from Beowulf, flee back to his marsh, and hide there. This was a different Herat than the hall he had emptied, but Hilgak's follower remembered his final boast and, standing erect, stopped the monster's flight, fastened those claws in his fists till they cracked, clutched Grendel closer. The infamous killer fought for his freedom, wanting no flesh but retreat, desiring nothing but escape. His claws had been caught. He was trapped. That trip to Herat was a miserable journey for the withering monster. The high hall rang, its roof boards swayed, and Danes shook with terror down the aisles, battle swept angry and wild. Herat trembled, wonderfully built to withstand the blows. The struggling great bodies beating at its beautiful walls, shaped and fastened with iron inside and out, artfully worked, the building stood firm. Its benches rattled, fell to the door. Gold-covered boards, grating as Grendel and Beowulf battled across them. Hrothgar's wise men had fashioned Herat to stand forever. Only fire they had planned could shatter what such skill had put together. Swallowed in hot flames, such splendor of ivory, iron, and wood. Suddenly sounds changed. The Danes started in new terror, cowering in their beds as the terrible screams of almighty enemies sang in the darkness, the horrible shrieks of pain and defeat, the tears torn out of Grendel's taut throat, Hell's captive caught in the arms of him who of all men on earth was the strongest, that mighty protector of men, meant to hold the monsters till its life leaped out, knowing the fiend was no use to anyone in Deathmark. All of Beowulf's band had jumped out from their beds, ancestral swords raised and ready, determined to protect their prince if they could. Their courage was great, but all wasted. They could hack at Grendel from every side, trying to open a path of evil soul, but their points could not hurt him. The sharpest and hardest of iron could not scratch at his skin, for that skin-stained demon had bewitched all men's weapons, laid spells that blunted every mortal man's blade. And yet his time had come. His days were over. His death was near. Down to hell he would go, swept, groaning, and helpless, to the waiting hands of still worse fiends. Now he discovered, once the afflicter of men, tormentor of their days, what it meant to feud with Almighty God. Grendel saw that his strength was deserting him, his claws bound fast, Hilgak's brave follower tearing at his hands. The monster's hatred rose higher, but his power had gone. He twisted in pain, and the bleeding sinews deep in his shoulders snapped, muscle and bone split and broke. The battle was over. Beowulf had been granted new glory. Grendel escaped, but wounded as he could flee to his den, his miserable hole in the bottom of the marsh, only to die, to wait for the end of all his days. And after that bloody combat, the Danes laughed with delight. He who had come to them from across the sea, bold and strong-minded, had driven affliction off, purged Heorot clean. He was happy now with that night's fierce work. The Danes had been served as he'd boasted he'd served them. Beowulf, a prince of the Geats, had killed Grendel, ended the grief, the sorrow, the suffering forced upon Hrothgar's helpless people by the bloodthirsty fiend. No Dane doubted the victory, for the proof, hanging high from the rafters where Beowulf had hung it, was the monster's arm, claw and shoulder and all.